Good morning. Welcome to the Point. This past week, we announced our second big debate of the year, this time with the candidates for governor from the Democratic Party. As you know, earlier this month, we hosted the Republicans. Now on June 20th, the Democratic candidates will be here in this studio to talk about issues and what's next for the state of Michigan. This week, we also sat down with the chairman of the Democratic Party. Brandon Dillon talks about a big election cycle and what he hopes may happen. Mr. Chairman, this is going to be an election cycle that is going to get a lot of attention, and it's going to get a lot of attention from Republicans and Democrats. Sure. Libertarians are on the primary ballot for the first time. So there's a lot going on. Let's start by just talking about the general way you approach this, because after 2016, after what we saw happen in some of the midterm elections, the Democrats have felt like they are poised, and when I talk to you and when I've talked to others, and the elections haven't panned out the way that they wanted them to. So as we look at 2018, there's a lot on the line out there.
Well, it's a huge election cycle. Not only just because every election cycle is a big election cycle, but this is the first time we're going to have basically every constitutional office open in the state of Michigan this year, from governor to attorney general to secretary of state. There's no incumbent running for re-election. All the state house and state senate seats are up, all the congressional seats. Debbie Stabenow running for re-election on the Democratic side. And it's an election going into setting up a redistricting election in 2020. So there is a real premium on making sure that you can maximize the kind of wins that you need in a year like this, just as Republicans did in 2010 when they swept state government on the eve of redistricting, and we've seen as Democrats how consequential that can be.
Let's talk about redistricting. This isn't where I was going to start, but I think it's very informative to talk about this. As it is now, and we know that there may be a ballot initiative that could change this, but we won't get off in the weeds on that just now. As it is now, state house, state senate, whoever controls the governor's mansion, and perhaps the Supreme Court, are the folks who decide how the lines are drawn for state house seats, for state senate seats, and maybe as importantly as anything, U.S. congressional seats. So going into this cycle, we know that about 75% of all the members of the Senate are gone, but everybody who's elected to the Senate will still be there for redistricting. The House members won't necessarily be, because there'll be an ensuing cycle. So that race for Senate becomes really important, and obviously the race for governor, and that has a decade-long effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, there's 2 seats up this year that could determine whether it's going to be a Democratic-leaning balance or Republican-leaning balance. And we've seen in the past that when there's a stalemate between the House and the Senate and the governor, when you have divided government, the Supreme Court ends up writing those lines. So it's very important to have justices on there who are aware of that process and will do that fairly. But you're right, the Senate is going to be very important this year. Democrats have been way down in the Senate, but we see a huge opportunity this year. There's a lot of seats that are up. You said most of the seats are open. We've got seats here in Grand Rapids, in Muskegon, in Battle Creek, in Oakland County, in Saginaw, and the UP that are going to be extremely competitive this year, and the potential to make significant gains. And if we do see the kind of surge that we've seen in other places around the country, and particularly in Wisconsin, where they won a Senate seat that Donald Trump won by over 20 points, we could see a change there. But, you know, at the end of the day, we talked about this off air. These elections are unpredictable. There's certain things you can control, and there's certain things you can't control. We can't control what Donald Trump does every morning when he gets up and looks at his Twitter account. We can't control what goes on with the economy. We can't control a lot of things, but we can control, as Democrats in Michigan, what we're doing on the ground every day to talk to voters, to mobilize volunteers, to communicate the issues that we think people are motivated by, and that's what we're going to continue to do, and we hope that has a good outcome for us this year.
How hard is it to make people understand that I was having a conversation over the weekend and saying the very same thing. I've been doing this for a long time. Let me tell you what I know. I don't know. I mean, the fact of the matter is that anybody who tells you with certainty how these elections are going to come out is either woefully uninformed or not being honest, because this is a very volatile time, and that's got to be tough when you're talking to your fellow Democrats, because I was over at the convention earlier this spring, and they are very motivated.
Well, it's a good thing to have folks motivated. I mean, that's the one thing that we have that we think we can sustain is the motivation of Democratic voters, which consistently scores higher than Republican voters. And in a midterm election where Democrats usually are much more disengaged than they are in presidential elections, that's a really positive thing for us. But I think, historically, we've had presidents of both parties who've kind of conformed to the parameters of which the Constitution allows, and that's made it maybe easy to predict. You don't expect a president to do things that are kind of out of that boundary, but this president has broken all the norms and continues to do so with threatening the Justice Department and doing rallies, 3.5 years before his reelection campaign. So it does provide an element of uncertainty, but there's certain things that we can know that are going to happen, and for us as Democrats, it's making sure that we increase voter turnout. Republican turnout in Michigan in off-year elections is pretty much the same every year, 2006, 2010, 2014. The number is solid and consistent. It's our number that goes up and down, and we want to make sure it stays up.
One of the things that we would normally say, and if you look at the lay of the land today for the U.S. House, and I look both nationally and here in the state, is that the party in power on that 2-year first term midterm election for a new president, they're going to lose seats in the House. And when you look at the number of Republicans that are not running for re-election, and when you look at the number even here in the state of races where there will be either open seats or some challenges, all of that seems to at least provide an opportunity. But as you say, the advent of Donald Trump may change that a little bit depending on how people turn out. How much of your focus is on U.S. House races versus state House races where we have seen the balance of power shift in the past few years as well? Because Democrats took over control during the Granholm administration, lost it then in 2010.
Well, for better or for worse, at the state level, we tend to have more interaction and direct work with state House and state Senate candidates. The congressional races a lot of times are really getting guidance and support from the DCCC or the RCCC on the Republican side. And there's a lot of reasons why that sometimes doesn't work so well. So what we've tried to do in the last year and a half is really do organizing around the state that's going to help every candidate. So we're coordinating as much as we can with targeted congressional races over in the 8th and the 11th congressional districts in Oakland and Ingham and Southeast Michigan. But we have a race here in the Kalamazoo market with Fred Upton, and you just saw that the Republicans have just put in kind of a shadow group allied with Speaker Ryan to start helping him campaign and put people on the ground, which is an indication, I think, that they know that seat is in play this year. So we work with all these campaigns to provide a basic level of kind of support by making sure we are motivating and turning out Democrats, but on a day-to-day basis, our interaction is going to be much more significant with those folks running for State House and State Senate.
You talked about the Upton race down there, and you've got, 6 candidates in a primary down there?
Last I counted, 6.
Something like that. So there has been more, at least more turnout in terms of people who say, I want to get involved in this. You have primaries in some of these other races too. How do you take, if you assume that all of those candidates build up a certain base of support, and when that primary is over, and you and perhaps the folks in Washington still are interested in that seat, how do you coalesce all of those people who have just done battle all the way through the first week of August?
Well, I think, putting the pieces back together can be contingent upon how many pieces get broken apart during the primary. So far we've been very fortunate that even in our gubernatorial primary and in our congressional primaries across the state, they have been focused on people's attributes and what they can bring to the seat, not going at each other and sniping and tearing each other down. And that's in stark contrast to the civil war that's going on between Brian Calley and Bill Schuette. I turn on the TV every day and see an ad from Brian Calley going after Schuette and one coming back, whether it's from a super PAC or the campaign. They have gotten increasingly nasty and really going after each other in a very personal way, which I think is going to make it much tougher on their side to turn those, to put those pieces back together. And similarly, in some of the congressional races where they have primaries over in the 11th congressional district, you're starting to see campaigns starting to take shots at each other. So, we've tried to encourage our candidates as much as we possibly can, because we can't control them, to stay positive. Democratic voters are looking for something positive, and if you have to draw a contrast with somebody, make sure it's based on policy, not some sort of attack.
You talked a little bit about some of your hopeful seats when you talked about the Senate. The House, the State House, is a little bit more volatile because we've seen seats change. I think of the one in Muskegon that is almost in every 2 years.
Yeah,
it's changed more often than any seat in our coverage area, at least since I've been here. But obviously, you're looking at others.
Yeah, a lot of them, frankly, are in West Michigan. There's going to be a few areas that I think provide some really rich targets this year. One is going to be Oakland County. Obviously, that's a big county with a lot of suburban seats where we've seen voters kind of being really turned off by Donald Trump and the kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House. But you've got seats in Kalamazoo, in Kent County, where we're looking to hold on to the 76th seat, and I think very confident we will. But there's a very competitive state Senate seat that will be coming out of here with our candidate Winnie Brinks, and in Muskegon and in Battle Creek. So, the road to the majority for Democrats is really run through West Michigan and Northern Michigan. We occupy a lot of the seats in the Detroit area, any Flint, Saginaw, Ann Arbor, anywhere we have concentrations of people in urban environments, we tend to do well. Where we've got to pick up are those marginal seats that go back and forth sometimes here in West Michigan, emblematic of which is the Muskegon seat, which seems to go back and forth every cycle. So if we win strongly, in West Michigan, we'll have a really good night on election night. So that's going to be an area to watch. You're going to be a very busy guy that night.
Yeah, we're already making plans for it right now, because as you start looking at some of these primaries, we know we have big races there, but then they set up some very interesting races in the general election. So this is going to be a presidential-like cycle for those of us who cover it, because there's going to be so much to do and so many places we have to go, not because you have the president coming in all the time, but there's so many of these races we're going to have to watch closely. And one of the races that also has outside pressure on it is the U.S. Senate race. Now, Senator Stabenow has been well established in that position, but if the Senatorial Committee for the Republicans sees an opening in any of these big races where you've got Democrats who are up for re-election, they have the ability, independent of the state, just like Democrats do, to come in and really try to put some pressure on. And so you also have to be prepared for that.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, I've worked closely with Debbie Stabenow over the last year and a half, 2 years preparing for this. There is nobody who works harder every day to make sure that doesn't happen. The national kind of mood, I think, is that Michigan's not really a top tier state in terms of a competitive Senate race. Well, don't tell that to Senator Stabenow, because she's running like it is, and I think that's one of the reasons she's ultimately going to be successful. No matter if they do see some sort of opening or decide to come in, she's building a foundation and a campaign that's going to be able to withstand that and stay positive and talk about her accomplishments.
One of the things that you as the chairman do is not only deal with candidates and the rest of the party, but you have to get out and you have to network. And Mackinac Island always comes to mind, because the Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference is coming up. In fact, as this airs, will only be a few days away.
Right.
What do you find, knowing you haven't been to that one yet, but knowing you have been to other such events, what do you find the conversation is when you're talking to business leaders or when you're talking to decision makers out there? Are they as focused? Well, they wouldn't be as focused as you are or I am, because this is kind of what we do. But are they as aware of the kind of daily combat that seems to be going on? Maybe not necessarily in Michigan, but certainly in Washington, and the kind of political upheaval that we seem to be in?
I don't know if they know, on a day-to-day basis what's going on, but I do think, I've talked to a number of business leaders and organizations that represent businesses in Michigan, and they are very well attuned to what's going on overall in the political environment here, and very much have an interest in what happens in particularly the statewide elections in Michigan. And one of the things I constantly hear is, people believe that Democrats have a great opportunity to win, and one thing that they're, I think, increasingly concerned about is Bill Schuette and the kind of revenue message that he's had. So for instance, on infrastructure, where you have the number one issue on people's minds is that we need to generate more money to pay for road repairs and bridge repairs and underwater infrastructure. And Bill Schuette goes and takes one of those no tax pledges, which basically says this isn't going to be a priority for me. So, I think business people are practical. They want a governor and a legislature and elected officials who actually understand their problems and are not going to be tied to kind of rigid ideological positions. And so I think they have an open mind about Democrats this year.
You talked a minute ago about what you called, I believe your words were, a civil war going on in the Republican Party. You certainly have your factions and coalitions within the Democratic Party too, and I mentioned earlier the endorsement convention, and again, it's a little hard to overstate the crowd because it was packed in there. But you also have some very different philosophies from folks within that room, and some of the union representatives and some of the other groups probably didn't get the result that they wanted coming out of that convention. Is that something that you can reel in time for November?
Well, one of the reasons we decided to have this endorsement convention was because we've seen in the past that when you do this late, it gives very little time, whether if it's a competitive election, to heal some of the wounds and bring people back together. So I believe that that process is ongoing and is going very well, that people understand what's at stake this year. And, ideological differences and policy differences, I think, are really healthy for a party to kind of grapple with internally. Where it becomes problematic and where it rises to the level of a civil war is, I think, when the two standard bearers from the Republican Party are just really getting personal with each other and really going after the character and the core of the person they're running against. That's when it becomes dangerous, not only for that race, but for the entire ticket as a whole. And we're working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen.
We've got about 60 seconds left. I know you said at the very beginning that this is a very important election, and as reporters, we always think that this is the most important election. But the political landscape has changed significantly over the past couple of years, and this is the first time since 2016 that people in large numbers, we've seen those individual primaries and a lot of focus on those, but this will be the first time that in large measure people will be expressing their opinion about where we are politically. How big a factor does Donald Trump become in this election? And I don't even wouldn't even suggest that you say which way, but how big a factor is he in this election?
He looms large over the entire midterms, and I think in two ways. One, on the Republican side, can Donald Trump motivate the people that came out for him to turn out and support a candidate that's not him? And on the Democratic side, we've seen it. He is a highly motivating force for people to come out and vote. We've seen it across the country. We see it in polling and research. He's got kind of a ceiling here in Michigan at about 42% maybe in public polling. So one number that we've seen in the last couple cycles that really determines people's motivation is the president's approval rating in the state and in any particular district. If it stays where it is today, that will mean Democrats are going to come out and make some changes. If it starts to tick up a little bit higher, I think that might change the equation a little bit.
Again, look for that debate with the Democratic candidates for governor on June 20th, 7 p.m. here on Wood TV. And if you have questions in the meantime, you can go to our website or any of our social media sites and suggest those questions. We'll be putting them all together for that debate coming up next month. And when we come back, another candidate for governor. He won't have a primary. We'll tell you why next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. A lot of the candidates for governor have already been with us here on To the Point, including Todd Schleicher, who dropped by for a second interview. He told us what he's learned about the process.
I've also learned that with all the candidates that we have out there, a lot of them, what they're doing is, we all know we have problems here in Michigan, but they're not putting out the solutions. And when I'm out there, I'm actually talking to the people and I am giving them my solutions. And a big one is with our auto insurance. And I was surprised, I watched your debate yesterday, and I was surprised at least one of the candidates, Pat Colbeck, actually was close to my numbers for auto insurance, because my plan is to cut it between 47 and 70%. He was at, if I remember right, 40 to 60%. But the problem is, a lot of these candidates that are out there, they're career politicians. And they've had all these years in office and they haven't done nothing to do it. So now they're bringing it back out that they want to do this, this, and this. Why haven't they done it before? why they've been in office. So that's where I'm coming at to the people, because I've never been a career politician. I'm just somebody who got angry enough to get into the race, with Flint being my hometown. So what I've learned is that they're just out there saying everything that we want to hear, but the two parties, they don't want us independents in the race. I believe they're afraid that we might actually do what we say we're going to do. So yeah, I've learned a lot since I've been in this, and I've learned each area of Michigan has different problems. So, I mean, that's like with the UP. I did not know that they had problems with broadband up there, which was a promise by Jennifer Granholm, not completed. So yeah, these are issues that we're tackling, and we are actually coming forward with solutions to each of them.
Well, you brought this up. Let's talk about auto no-fault insurance, because in this state, since I have been here, the legislature and several administrations have tried to deal with something to rein in the cost of no fault. They've been unsuccessful every time, because you can't get the insurance lobby, you can't get the medical lobby, you can't get these groups to come together and make some kind of a decision. But you say you have a solution. What is it?
Well, first off, that's the problem. They're out there trying to work with these insurance industry, and they're trying to deal with the lobbyists because they don't want to lose their paychecks from the lobbyists. I mean, we all know they're bought and paid for by the lobbyists. The idea is, if we take Michigan back to an at-fault state, I mean, there's only 12 states that are no fault. In every one of those states, the insurance companies are making money hand over fist. If we take Michigan back to an at-fault state, that'll automatically lower it almost 47%.
Now, how does that lower 47%? By doing away with catastrophic claims fund?
No. What we want to do with the MCCA, which is the Michigan Catastrophic Claims Account, we want to make it optional. Okay, that actually jumps it to almost 70% just by making it optional. Years ago, when we used to get our insurance, homeowners insurance, auto insurance, we could go up there and say, this is what we want covered. Not anymore. The insurance industries say, this is what you're going to pay. We don't have that option. The problem is they've lost the connection between the customer and the industry. All they are out there for is to make as much money as they possibly can. Same thing with health insurance. I mean, and you can use the MRI as a perfect example. If you're on Medicaid and the state's paying for it, that MRI costs right around $500, just a little under. If you're on Medicare, it's just a little under $700. But if you're on Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Humana, they bill almost $5,000 for that same MRI. You can go down to Basha in Royal Oak right now and pay $250 for a MRI. So these are the issues. We need to set up a payment plan and force the industry to follow the state, or at least compete with the state, because I have a plan to bring a single-payer system right here to Michigan. At the same time, it's utilizing Blue Cross Blue Shield's own numbers against them, and they don't like that.
When you talk about coming up, you're really talking about a pay schedule or a fee schedule for services that would be paid.
Yes.
So then you have to get the providers to provide those services at that cost. How do you do that?
Well, you just flat out tell them, this is what we're going to do. We have to get control of the cost of insurance and for the hospital providers. I mean, you got Beaumont. They're constantly out there saying they need more money, they need more money. Well, they made $4 billion profit. Okay, so again, that's the same thing. I'm not knocking them for making money. That's the reason of being in business. But the services provided, I mean, when they bill your insurance company, they triple it and 10 times the amount of what the services actually costs. And I understand, I mean, you go to a hospital and you're paying $20 for an aspirin. How's that fair to the people who are out there going to these hospitals and clinics? You know, we need to get things under control so that we can actually get the services affordable. I mean, the idea of health insurance and auto insurance being mandatory means we got to keep it affordable for the people. Because under auto insurance right now, we've got probably, I think the state was rated that we have some of the best drivers. But that's because the insurance is so high, they're afraid to go out and drive. Of course, we've also probably have the highest amount of dirty drivers, or drivers without insurance, because they can't afford it. Because you got auto insurance where some people are paying more for that auto insurance than their own car note. And this isn't affordable for the people of Michigan. This is the insurance industry, to me, is the biggest culprit of what's driving families into these situations where they can't afford anything.
You'll be hearing from other candidates as the weeks go on, and we'll be back with more To the Point. So another big debate coming up in June, and of course interviews with a lot of candidates starting next week from Mackinac Island at the Detroit Policy Conference. Hope you'll join us next Sunday at 10 for To the Point.